Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of Andy Saunders, who's been in PR for decades and began his career generally at Creation Records in the early 90s and then went on to form his own company called Velocity Communications. So this is the interview, so you'll learn more about Andy's interest in life and much more. So after several minutes of interest and casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject that was the early formative years. Andy, it's over to you.
Do you know, it's funny, you're a year older than me. I was born in 65. And I had a fairly nomadic childhood because I was a £10 pom, which was a scheme ran by the Australian government to encourage people to come over and work in their underpopulated country, as it was in the 60s. And so we were living in Dagenham in kind of on the Essex East London borders. And my dad just stuck us on a boat and we went to Australia for several years. And so I kind of came back and then we lived in there for a while and then we moved down to Kent. So I never really kind of grabbed hold of anything. My first record that I ever had, and I'm not ashamed of it, was David Cassidy's Daydreamer.
Beautiful.
Was the first record, and I think swiftly followed by The Show Must Go On by Leo Sayer.
Classic.
All of that stuff that you referred to. And I did a podcast recently, a music industry podcast, and they did a thing called "What's your best record?" And the record, my awakening, the record that kind of made me think was London Calling by The Clash. And I was slightly older. I wasn't really obsessed with music until I was in my early teens, until I was like 12, 13, 14. And when I was 14, London Calling came out in Christmas 1979. And I told this story recently when a friend came into school who had a big brother and had a copy of London Calling, the single, and was sort of shaking hands when, have you heard this? Have you got a record player? And I was like, well, my dad's got one. And he said, well, borrow this and bring it back tomorrow. And I played it 25 times in a row and was like, this is amazing. And then the album came out, just after Christmas, and I bought it with my Christmas money, and then I was off. Then I was just like done. Then I was just completely into that sort of later punk new wave thing. That was my proper awakening in music. But I was watching Top of the Pops like everybody else and absorbing the mainstream.
Yes.
Until that moment where I kind of found my music, really.
Yes.
Sort of late to punk, but it was a revolution when it came.
Yes, it's interesting. I had an older brother in the 70s and he was into the prog rock world, and I kind of looked up to him with great kind of, wow, this is brilliant music. I consumed all those classic albums with Roger Dean posters and gatefold sleeves and was mesmerized. But
when we came back, sorry to interrupt, when we came back from Australia, we moved down to Canterbury in Kent, and the Canterbury scene, of course, was Caravan and and all
Soft
of those.
Machine.
Yeah, Soft Machine, Robert Wyatt, all of those kind of like proggy, not wizard proggy, but sort of proggy nonetheless. Stuff. And so the school I went to, it was kind of, you were either into 20-minute guitar solos and King Crimson, or you were into the punk, the Damned and the Ramones and the Clash, and I was in the kind of latter camp, really. But I it was in my DNA because of where I grew up, really.
Yes.
So I never really related to it until kind of later life, when I went back to it and thought, it's actually quite good.
Well, I think another member of Soft Machine passed away, didn't he? And I think it's just Robert Wyatt left now. So, yes, that was today's news, I think. Yes, there you go. Breaking news there. Yeah, well, it was interesting because I grew up in the, and I think environment means a lot because I grew up in the countryside in East Anglia. So, and that was heavy metal and Status Quo and, the classic Deep Purples. And then that was it. Everyone had a leather jacket, denim jeans and a 250 Honda.
Came along.
Oh, yes. And again, it's kind of interesting because that was, I've sort of, and you've probably seen this as well. I find that every 5 years there's a bit of a new turnover of 16 to 18-year-olds who kind of direct the charts, and things change again because the old guard have slightly lost it. And it doesn't mean it's just prog, but it can be punk. Suddenly a few years of punk and it's like, oh, this is terrible. This is not good music anymore. But
Well,
and
it
then
gets commercialized, doesn't it, David? I think that's what happens. Is I think once it gets pushed through the kind of music industry machine, it sort of loses some of its vitality. And when restrictions get put on it, when it's like we need a hit, we need a single, we need to go out on tour, we need to package it. It suddenly loses some of that underground vitality. And you saw it recently with some of the really interesting black music that was coming out of London, around Skepta and Stormzy, and they had to create their own infrastructure. It didn't exist. They had their own pirate radio. They had their own, sort of online communities, social media communities, because it didn't exist for them. And then, of course, the major record labels grabbed hold of it, pushed it through their machine. It suddenly became a bit bland, and everybody went somewhere else. And I think it kind of illustrates what you're saying about, and it's kind of good in a way that, I've got a 21-year-old daughter, and she is constantly picking things up and dropping them. There doesn't seem to be any real, sort of tribal element to what she did. Like well, certainly for me, I don't know about you, but it was very tribal when I was growing up.
yes.
And there doesn't seem to be that element. It's like, hey, I love Sabrina Carpenter, and I love drill, and I love some of the kind of heavy metal that's coming out of Brazil. It's like there's no tribal element of pinning your colours to a mask. I think the only kind of tribal thing that's around at the moment is Taylor Swift, where that feels very tribal. Everything else is slightly disposable.
Yes. Well, it was, talking of the quo, I mean, you couldn't admit to liking two-tone or mod music. You would literally be beaten up or chased down the street. So even appearing to nod along to, Mirror in the Bathroom was like, my God, that could just get you into a lot of trouble because, it was very, as you say, tribal, those
It was.
village hall discos could get quite edgy, when all those little boys in
Really
their
good. Yeah, it was
50
violent.
cc mopeds turned up, or 125s, it was business.
FS1Es.
Yes, well, I had
Yeah,
I
they
had one
did.
of those
Did
50cc
you? You were very
mopeds.
lucky. I never did, But yes, you're absolutely right. The kind of tribality of tribalism of music back in the kind of 70s and 80s was, it goes back to the mods and the rockers, doesn't it? And punks and Teds and all that stuff, and yeah, I think young men always want to fight. They always want to have something to have a tear up about. And I think that's why music and football has such a crossover, is there's that element of kind of rage and passion and just wanting to have a punch up, and I think
Yes.
certain elements of music that certainly happened when I was growing up. It's interesting. I go back to the Clash. Who'd have thought that young suburban white boys from Kent would get an education in reggae from the Clash? You know what I mean? And it's like suddenly we're all thinking we really like reggae. It's great, and then we investigated it a bit more. Thanks to Joe.
Yes.
And it was bands like that that basically said, or the Specials, with Ska, or as you mentioned, it's really interesting to see how tribal young men can actually be sort of pushed in a different direction. I think that doesn't happen enough now.
No, it's yeah. I mean, it is. I suppose Taylor Swift does occasionally because she'll cover something that like it was at Blue Nile recently, and suddenly it was like, oh no, she said she liked Blue Nile, or
Yeah.
there was something, I don't know. And I'd missed Blue Nile during the 80s, actually, though you shouldn't be. But yeah, talking of that kind of moment, I always remember seeing Jack Kerouac, not literally at the time, on one of those talk shows where he was drunk and abusive. And he just hated the hippie movement, didn't he? But the hippie movement bought the book, went, this is amazing. We love Jack Kerouac. And when he met them, he was like, oh my God, it was like, oh my, he hated them. He suddenly went from
Awful.
it was like he suddenly became one of those far right types,
Yeah.
almost overnight, living with his mother, being abusive and dying, in his bed. It is kind of strange, that development. And
a lot of those kind of, those so-called kind of outlaw artists of that period, whether it was Hunter S. Thompson or whether it was Ginsberg or whether it was Kerouac or Cassidy. I mean, they weren't nice people.
No,
they weren't people you should probably follow. I mean, we all loved On the Road, let's be honest, and Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, and then we all read that voraciously, but they're not good people.
no. I mean,
Cassidy particularly was awful, wasn't he?
And Burroughs,
Burroughs, I mean, Burroughs, was basically
shooting his wife.
I think it's the second time I've used the expression heroin chic. You know what I mean? It's like, an awful junkie.
Yes. So look,
I worked a lot with Bob Mould.
Did you?
I did. Yeah, I worked on the Sugar album, Copper Blue.
Nice.
So it was the first record I worked on when I joined Creation Records.
Well, interesting. But look, when you get to 16, that's 1981, were you quite, because at that time there'd been the Falkland War, the miners' strike, Greenham Common. Did you, at that age, leave school, or did you stay on for A levels and then a degree, or get politicised and ranty?
So again, story I told recently, I failed. I went to a grammar school. I was that kind of clever working class kid thing, passed my 11 plus, went to a grammar school. No cultural capital, so I didn't really fit in there. Left at 15 after my 5 O levels that I got at C grade, which allowed me to go to the local tech college to do my O levels. I subsequently failed. I mean, literally failed. And my dad was a policeman, and my dad said, "I'm sorry. You've got to go and do something. I'm not going to have you sitting around the house smoking weed and listening to punk rock. You've got to go and do something. You either got to go and get a job or you've got to go to college." And I'm like, "Well, I can't go to college because I've got any A levels." And he went, "Leave that with me." And he basically forged my A levels, or he got someone to forge my A levels. And so I turned up at Middlesex Polytechnic with forged A level certificates, and they let me in. So I did a BA in combined studies, which essentially was kind of drama and art history. And did become politicised. I mean, you did in those days in the 80s, particularly if you went to University Polytechnic, in my case, in London, because you're right, it was the miners' strike. That was the kind of key thing. And of course, where I grew up in Kent, there was a colliery called Aylsham, which my mum was a teacher in the town. And so my granddad was a miner. My granddad came down from Durham, where he was a miner, to work in Fords, hence being in Dagenham. So mining was kind of in my blood, really. And so, I became very politicised around the miners' strike, and around, student cuts. And I went on every march going, to be honest. It was.
And then Red Wedge, did that come into?
Red Wedge, I thought Red Wedge was a bit silly. I didn't, I kind of admired Paul Weller and Billy Bragg and all those guys. I mean, I kind of admired it, but I just thought it was a bit silly. My politics were the politics of kind of, the socialist worker. They weren't the mainstream party politics. I wasn't at that point really interested in the vote. I was just interested in being a gobshite and protesting. I wasn't really interested in getting people into the election, but I was very immature. As I grew older, that became, much more of a priority. I did a lot of work with Tony Blair, a lot of work with Alistair Campbell around the election of the Labour government in 1997. So I did actually grow up at some point. But at the time, it was a bit like punk rock. It was just like, how can we be loud and obnoxious and shouty?
Did the Redskins come into your life at that point?
Oh, yeah, I love the Redskins.
The Clash meets Motown.
Neither Washington nor Moscow, international socialism. Just amazing. I listened to the Redskins the other day. It came up on a algorithmic playlist on Spotify, and I just thought, what an underrated band. They were amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the biggest mystery I've ever known, nearly, is what happened to the lead singer, or any of the members, but the lead singer, because he was there and he's completely disappeared, never to be seen again.
Well, he probably looks like me. He probably looks like, a balding, overweight, 60-year-old suburban bloke. Probably looks exactly like me, as most of them do.
But you were, the lead singer of the Redskins, and then you've just totally managed to disappear, not even raising your little brow above the parapet. I mean, I think it's just weird. I mean, weird, interesting, and curious and fascinating. That's all. I think that's the thing. So then, as you did your degree, so that took
Yeah.
you up to the late 80s.
Coming up to 1987.
87.
Yeah.
1987. Oh yeah, so
84 to 87, I was at Middlesex Poly.
one of the great years of music, and you know that was when Husker Du brought out their classic album, which does sound a bit tinny now, Warehouse, compared to Candy Apple Grey. But did you start getting into the American thrash rock scene at this?
Well, as I said, worked with Bob Mould.
You worked with Bob Mould.
Yeah, I mean, I love the kind of Minneapolis scene placements and Husker Du, and you know, and you know, particularly Candy Apple Grey was just an amazing record. I don't think any of the Husker Du albums were particularly well produced, to be honest. You know, I listen to them now and I think it's a real shame because, you know, they are great songs that weren't really done justice. I mean, they were fantastically influential on what came after them, you know, with Nirvana and the Pixies and REM. But, you know, I just think the records themselves, I listened to Candy Apple Grey fairly recently and I just thought it's a bit disappointing production wise. Maybe that's heresy. Maybe you're going to get loads of letters. So don't ever get him on again. He's talking nonsense.
No, no, it's.
I think it's a record that is trying to sound produced, doesn't quite get there.
Yes, I agree. I think there's a bit more organicness with Candy Apple Grey, whereas the Warehouse album it just sounds a bit tinny and a bit.
Yeah.
But another album, which you always one says, oh yeah, that's a classic. But when I listened to it recently, and I really became a big Prince fan during that time. But oh God, what's the classic album? Sign of the Times. Is it the double? Yeah, that seemed. I kept jumping tracks, going, oh, this is a bit irritating. This is a bit. Actually, some of these songs are really bad. You know, not bad, but you know, they're not as good as I can remember. It was almost like, God, that was that classic album that you always have to go, that's a classic. But you think, yeah, but when was the last time you played it from start to finish?
And I think artists like Prince are not album artists. You know, I never, you know, for me, they were pop artists. And Sign of the Times, I think, was record of the year that year. I just think it was amazing. I mean, utterly amazing. But I'm not really interested in sitting down and listening to a Prince album. You know, maybe that's just incredibly reductive of me, you know, to think. I always thought Prince was a pop star, you know, and then he had amazing singles. You know,
Yes.
And I just wasn't really interested in kind of listening to a collection of, you know, because he was also bonkers as well. So I always and you know, I always had the impression that if you did listen to a Prince album, you'd be going down all sorts of strange alleyways and probably coming up with some fairly self-indulgent nonsense.
Yes.
I mean, you know, that was I never really sat down and listened to it. So that's just my supposition, which seems like you confirm. So
absolutely. So look, then the end, you know, the poll tax is here, Thatcher's nearly gone. So then what happens to your career post-degree?
So in 1987, I was struggling to be an actor. You know, I wanted to be Tim Roth. I wanted to do Burkoff plays.
Meantime?
Meantime, Phil Daniels actually ended up being a really good friend of mine, and you know, I wanted to be in Mike Leigh films, and I wanted to be that kind of edgy English actor that Tim Roth was, and later Ray Winstone and Phil Daniels, and I wanted to be Quadrophenia. I wanted to do that. Failed miserably because again, no cultural capital, no idea how to get an equity card. Went to a poly, didn't go to a stage school, so no real chance. And I was starving one Christmas, and a friend that I was kind of sharing a Withnail and I type house with basically said, I'm working in this warehouse in Manor House in North London. Do you want to come and get some cash in hand work? And I was like, yeah. And it was a record company. And it was an import export record company called Pacific Records. And they basically ship records in from America and ship records from the UK to America. And I was in the warehouse kind of packing boxes, vinyl, CDs, and eventually got a job in sales. And eventually they started to sort of do their own stuff, and they started to make a real impact in acid house. So they did amazing records like Fingers Inc., Can You Feel It, Bam Bam, Where's Your Child? Acid House classics came out.
Yes.
There. It was great, you know, and then, but it wasn't very much money. And I got headhunted to go and work for another record company in West Drayton in West London, which was classical music. And I did it for the money. I did it completely for the money, but it was quite an interesting learning curve. And after that, I ended up at Roadrunner Records, working in heavy metal, back to heavy metal, but extreme
Lovely.
heavy. Sepultura.
Was that Bruce Dickinson was on that label?
No, I don't think I ever worked on a Bruce Dickinson record. It was much more extreme than Bruce Dickinson. It was Brazilian death metal, and it was Deicide, and people like that. They ended up having huge success with Slipknot and Nickelback, but that was a long time after I'd left. And they brought me in basically to start running an indie label. But culturally, it didn't work. It just didn't work. You couldn't get, sort of indie bands, to come and work in an environment that was funded by heavy metal. It just never worked. And I ended up getting fired because I wasn't very good at it. And to cut a very long story short, I ended up at Creation Records. And that is really when my career took off.
Yes. So Creation had, what I always thought was amazing with Creation Records is that during the 80s, there was some of the most bizarre bands and artists that got, I did an interview with Clive Langer the other day, and he was like, God, you did a single on Creation Records. I listened to it, I thought, wow, that sounds awful. But I can't believe it. And then Simon Fisher Turner, who was so engaging, did an album once, and it's like he laughed. He said, probably 10 people must have bought it. I thought Alan must have wondered what the hell he had invested in. I mean, it's an artistic, oddity and self-indulgence, and it had a very famous actress on it as well, who I can't remember her name now. But it's like, God, how did Alan fund that? And Momus was on it, and there was a lot of these.
We once did a campaign with Momus because I was in PR and marketing. And Alan said, I don't know how to do this Momus record. It wasn't one of the great records. It was one of his, like fading records. And I ended up doing an advert in the NME. It said, if Momus is so shit, why haven't Creation dropped him? That was the marketing campaign for Momus. I mean, look, Alan, I've said it many, many times. I love Alan. He's been a huge mentor to me, and he's crazy. I don't agree with everything he does. He's quixotic. He's, he can be really difficult and really tricky, but I think he's an incredible maverick in the music industry. And his biggest strength is that he reacts to everything on an emotional basis. His biggest weakness is that he reacts to everything on an emotional basis, But what that means is you end up with Ed Ball and The Legend and The Loft and, all of these bands, artists, projects, that would never see the light of day anywhere else. But Alan would become friends with them, or he'd be impressed with their drug taking, or he'd be impressed with some aspect of them and put their record out. And Biff Bang Pow and all this stuff, that came out in those early days of of Creation, and the very early Primal Scream stuff that was on the C86 original.
Yes.
All that stuff, nobody wouldn't have found a home anywhere else.
No, absolutely.
Out of the Jazz Butcher and out of all of those, really early things that came out, Doing It for the Kids compilation album. Some amazing stuff came out of that. I don't think commercially amazing or even critically amazing, but culturally amazing. Because it created a scene that laid the foundations for some really important music that came after it.
So had My Bloody Valentine recorded their classic album when you started, or was that still
I came in at the back end of what I call the big four. So Loveless, My Bloody Valentine, Teenage Fan Club, Bandwagon-esque, Rides Nowhere, and and there was another one. Sorry, my mind's gone blank. But Primal Scream, Screamadelica.
Scream.
So the big four that kind of really set Creation up as a mainstream,
yes,
record label that their records were getting played on Top of the Pops, and that. Before that, it'd all been kind of crazy indie, shambolic stuff. And then those four records came out. Suddenly, Creation were, as they say, in the game. Internationally. That's when I joined. I joined from Roadrunner to kind of, to handle media and press.
Yes.
And ended up becoming director of communications.
So going back to Bob Mould, he'd done, obviously Husker Du had broken up, and then he did his solo album Workbook, which was beautiful, but
really quite dark.
Lovely acoustic piano instrumental, and it's some great songs on it. But he's not looking great.
Records though, weren't they, David? Tough records. I think Black Sheets of Rain and Workbook are really tough records. They have a beauty, but I find them incredibly dark.
Another lonely, yes, and also sometimes you think, oh, Bob, not another lonely afternoon on your own. I can't cope at the
Get some
moment.
friends, Bob.
Yes, change your sweater and get some
Well,
sexier
he was
clothes.
struggling for many, many years with his homosexuality and the fact that he hadn't come out and didn't feel able to come out and only came out in later life, and subsequently has really embraced his gayness and and has written a book about it, but that was all massively internalized, and even when I was working with him, he was having conversations with me about, how do I do this? I'm like, well, just do it. Nobody's going to judge you. Nobody's going to say, well, will I lose all my fans? I might, I'm like, why would they love your music? They love you, just come out and just say it, I want to take credit for it, but I was kind of scratching my head going, I don't understand why this is even a conversation.
Yes.
Just say it.
Well, it was interesting because I did an interview with Patrick from the Kitchens of Distinction, and he was just straight out there, and that was it. It was like, oh, well, okay, that's fine. Is your music any good? That's the main thing, isn't it? At the end of the day, as a fan, you just want to. We all love Bronski Beat's couple of singles because they were great singles. It didn't really matter, and Boy George, who cares? If you either liked it or you didn't. But again, as a music person, you don't really bother that much. I mean, if they're politics,
yeah, it's interesting. I spoke to what's his name? He managed Wham.
Yes, Wham and Bauhaus. No, Japan. Simon
Napier Bell.
That's the man.
Yeah, and he wrote a couple of books, and he was famously out, and at a time in the 60s when it was illegal to be out, and grew up in, his words, queer London, and and talked a lot about in the early days how difficult it was, but also how easily people accepted it, and it was never, he never found it an issue. He found it an issue legally, before because he's must be in his late 70s now, but and in terms of his career and whatever, he never found it an issue.
Yes.
It was really interesting. I interviewed him in front of a bunch of students at the University of Hertfordshire, and he was really fascinating on the subject.
I know. There was a really lovely bloke who I've done a few interviews with, and he died recently. He did various books all about gay, queer and stuff, and he did one on the 60s managers, not all of them, but quite a lot. And they were all
Larry Parnes and and
Epstein,
Telstar guy, and
yes, amazing. So look, so then Sugar is kind of, so is it the case then that they're trying to get a record label to sign them or license it in the UK, and Alan was the only one who was going to take it on?
That one there.
That one.
That's the Sugar disc. So somebody had approached Alan. I mean, Alan had liked that kind of post-hardcore scene, that came out of America. I don't think he was a massive, a massive expert in it or delved in it, but he liked it. He liked, the kind of punk element of it. And I think Bob's manager at the time had gone to Alan and said, would you be interested? And Alan said, yeah, sure. Like, Alan was pretty much up for it if he liked it. And I joined the company, and the first week, it was the first record they gave me, and they went, right, this one's yours, off you go. And I was like, it's Bob Mould. It's amazing. And I rang up, and I rang up the NME, and I said, I've got the new Bob Mould record, and they said, send it over, and they rang me back going, this is amazing, we'll cover it. And that had never happened to me before. I'd never had that kind of reaction. So, I hit the ground running at Creation with this amazing record that went on to be NME Album of the Year, and and again, like his earlier records, hugely influential on that kind of, sort of post-Americana scene, that was Sonic Youth and Nirvana and all those bands that were gaining mainstream attention. Bob Mould was seen as a sort of grandfather figure in it. It was a great record to work on. I spent a lot of time with him on tour, and he was a brilliant, mature artist, who had a very, very clear vision about what he wanted to do. I think he released a lot of bad records after that, but his argument would be, it's what I was feeling at the time. It's what I wanted to do.
I seem to remember there was a disco one, not a disco, a dance one. That
dance music one. Yeah, there's some EDM ones, and in fact, the last record that he did for Creation, I was in New York, and I went to see him, and he played it to me, and I didn't want to say it was a bit dull, but it was. And he said, I'm really struggling for a title. And he said, I mean, and let's be honest, this is probably going to be the last Dog and Pony Show. And I said, well, call it that. Call it the last Dog and Pony Show. And he did. And I meant it as a kind of backhanded insult, much as I love Bob Mould, and that came out, that record, the last Dog and Pony Show. It's like, and it was all right. But Copper Blue and its sister album, Beaster, were absolute works of genius, I think. Absolute.
That's right, because he does. There's a song called Tilted on
Tilted. JC Auto and Tilted are just amazing records.
And they're the ones that I kind of took out and went, yeah, these are the ones. The Tilted is especially the way they managed to keep that together is quite extraordinary, really. And it was an amazing man, because I saw.
Didn't do either of those songs live very often because they wrecked his voice. So whenever he did it once every 4. It was like a baseball pitcher. He could only play it once every 4 days because otherwise it would just wreck his voice, because it was such an intense song. Tilted,
Tilted. Yes.
Which went with it as well. I'm Not Your Jesus Christ. It's just fantastic.
Because I had a fantastic drummer, Malcolm Travis, who had been in this band called the Human Sexual Response, which was another one of those brilliant bands as well. So, yes, an interesting.
One of the most powerful drummers I ever worked with, like an absolute beast, John Bonham type beast of a drummer as well. Because it was a 3-piece. People forget Sugar was a 3-piece.
It was very much. But I did once ask him, I said, could I do an interview with you? And he said, yes, but I don't want to talk about Sugar.
Did he?
And yes, it was. I've had a few people who've just said, I don't want to talk that part of my career. It's like, oh, okay. Who knows?
My really average EDM record.
So once you were there in creation, obviously you saw the birth of this amazing label, didn't you? Did you then continue with them for most of the 90s?
Well, until they did a deal with Sony just about when I joined, and I think in 92, where they sold 49% of the label to Sony. And then in 2000, the end of 1999, they sold the remaining 51%. And so I was there from 92 to 2000. And, was one of the last people to turn the lights off as we left, unfortunately. But, why not? They cashed out. I think Alan made a huge amount of money out of it. So.
Yes. And New Labour, we had the John Major years, obviously, there, and then New Labour. So when did you become part of the Team Tony?
Well, it started off as a bit of a joke, really. I mean, Alan's a kind of working class boy from Glasgow, and I'm a working class boy from Dagenham originally, and so we both had kind of Labour affiliations. And Alan received a letter from Virginia Bottomley, who was then the culture secretary, or the equivalent of the culture secretary, and then what it was called then. And it was a letter inviting him to Downing Street to talk about the music industry. And he was like, oh, we should go to this. And I was like, no, you can't go to that. She's a Tory. And he was like, yeah, I suppose, what should we do? And I said, well, look, why don't I ring up Jack Cunningham, who is he's the shadow culture secretary for Labour. And they're looking good. They're looking good at the moment. The polls are good. Why don't we go and see Jack Cunningham? So we jumped in a cab, and and I'd already called him, set up the meeting. And on the way there, we were both like, "What are we going to say? We had no idea. This is just what are we even doing?" So we got there, and it was a bit of a strange meeting with Jack Cunningham going, "Well, thanks for coming in, but who are you? And what do you want?" And we sort of looked at each other, going, "I don't know. We're just pleased to be here, really, like naughty schoolboys." And then all of a sudden, Alan said, "Right, here's what we do. Right, we get a poster. And on one side is Damon Albarn, and on the other side is Liam Gallagher. And we just say in the middle, the only thing they hate more than each other is the Tories." And I was like, "We've not discussed this, Alan. Where'd this come from?" And he just sort of blagged it. And then that was a bit of a kind of weird meeting. But then we later got a call from Alistair Campbell. And he said, "Well, I am interested," and then we started to talk to him fairly seriously about how we could help out. So
And then then you were there right through the campaign.
I was there. Well, yeah, and we ended up at the Royal Festival Hall on the night of the election. We got invited to that, and we'd go and have meetings with Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell and donate money, and they'd say, "Well, how's this going to play out? What's the optics of this with the youth vote? And can we get Oasis to do this? Or famously, can 18 Wheeler come and play at our kind of Blackpool youth conference, where Tony Blair." Famously referred to them as Wheeler 18 when he introduced them. So it was, yeah, we did all sorts of things with them. We were keen. We used to work with Margaret McDonough, who was the sort of the chair of the Constitutional Labour Party, and she used to come to Chelsea with us. So and Lord Wahid Ali, who's been in the news recently, we did a lot of work with him because he was on the scene. So yeah, I'd like to claim a little bit of credit.
Well,
A little bit
yes.
of credit for that election. And also, as well, we were behind the New Deal for musicians. That was something we pushed through, myself and Alan, which was allowing musicians to claim unemployment benefit, which had never been done before. It's the only bit of Britpop legislation.
Well, I know. Well, I think the reason there were so many indie bands and labels, or bands and musicians, was that during the 80s, unemployment was quite easy to claim. And then you had job seekers allowance, enterprise allowance schemes, and all the other bits like your council tax and housing benefit paid. And it sort of gave people almost a little bit of a, I don't know, grant or leniency between that and having to get a proper job, or I don't know, having a soul destroying life. So I think, because I found that most bands had, especially in the indie world of the 80s, had that 5-year narrative. They get together, 12-month honeymoon period, they get a single, John Peel played it, then a John Peel session, first album, transit van around all the little clubs, in the UK, then the tricky second or third album, European tour, the American tour, and then it just explodes into a disaster, doesn't it? Like
I agree with all of that, and I would add as well, the other thing that I think is hugely important is the cheap housing in London,
yes.
and particularly squats and the squat scene. Free housing, and that goes all the way back to punk. The Clash squatting in Maid of Vale, and bands and myself squatting in Clerkenwell for a while, with the House of Love, who I worked with, and various other things. So I think cheap housing in London allowed bands to really focus on being bands, and of course
Yes.
now it's just posh kids whose dads can afford to buy them expensive acoustic guitars,
That's
so that they can whimper into a microphone.
it. Whimper. Yes, because I just did the the drummer with the 101ers who did a book, didn't he? Oh, that's it. Squat City Rocks.
There you go.
Richard. There you go. That was yes. So yes, squatting, and also during that period, you had a lot of bands from Australia and New Zealand would come and also
Yes.
squat. And then you had was it the ambulance station in North London?
Yeah, I played there. Played at the ambulance station, the Old Kent Road. Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah, I did. I was in a band. I was in a band with sort of early members of the House of Love. I was a drummer, and I was in a band with early members of the House of Love, and we were called the Shaman before the Shaman came along. And we used to play the ambulance, the old, the ambulance place down the Old Kent Road. Yeah.
Brilliant. Was Terry in the
And
band
also the
then?
cinema in Clerkenwell. We used to play that as well. When the abandoned cinema that we used to go and squat and play gigs in.
Fantastic. So as you know, with obviously there's huge success, in the 90s for creation, but then you also had the Tricky album by people like Kevin Rowland, who did that album, which is My Beauty, which had it was that a hard sell? Was that a tricky one to work with?
Well, the great story behind that, David, was when I got I mean, I was a mass. If you ask me what my favourite albums are, I'm going to say London Calling, but I'm probably going to say Searching for the Young Soul Rebels as well.
Classic.
A very, very close second. And so I was a massive Dexys fan, a huge Dexys fan. And when Kevin was introduced to me in the office, he came in looking like Henry VIII. He had this huge sort of, this huge Henry VIII type coat on. And I was like, "You're Kevin Rowland." And he sort of looked at me as if to say, "Well, obviously." And I was awestruck. And I was like, "Oh, here's Kevin." He signed into the label. I'm like, "Brilliant." And so I was appointed as his publicist. And we had to put a press release out saying, Kevin's joined the label. And I wrote this press release and, standard stuff. Kevin Rowland's joining Creation. We're all very excited. New record coming out, usual stuff. And I'm at the zoo with my very small children at the time, London Zoo. And I get a call on my Bricklight mobile. And it's Kevin Rowland. And he's like, "Got some issues with this press release." And I'm like, "Okay." He's like, "Well, you've said that I've signed to Creation." I'm like, "Yeah, well, you have." And he's like, "Yeah, but I don't need that pressure, man." I'm like, okay. And he said, and you know, and you're saying that I've got a new record coming out, and I'm like, yeah. And he goes, well, again, it's the pressure, Andy. I just don't need it in my life. And right at the very end, you said, for more information, please contact Andy Saunders. And I've said, yeah. And he goes, well, the thing is, mate, there's no more information. And I'm like, okay. So we didn't end up putting a press release out. And then, of course, he did My Beauty, which was, you know, had a mixed reception, to say the least.
God, there you go. Was there ever a happy moment in that whole period?
He was very intense to work with. He was very, very intense, and I think probably having some personal issues at the time, you know, which I think these days would be easier to spot, you know, with our knowledge of kind of mental illness. I think
Yes.
we probably would have kind of said, "Oh, he's having some kind of crisis," and at the time we were just like, "Oh, it's Kevin. He's just mad," you know. And actually, he was probably having some kind of breakdown, and you know, it was you know, it wasn't fun. It was intense, you know, because you'd get these, you know, sort of railing faxes, as they were at the time. Fax would end up my handwritten fax, you know. Would he once he wanted to confess that, you know, the Touraye album was mainly written by Kevin Archer, and that he'd done Kevin Archer really wrong by not giving him enough credit and enough royalties, and he wanted to kind of like put this out there publicly. And then so Piers Morgan, who was then writing for the Mirror,
Yes.
the Mirror, and you know, he wrote a long story going, basically, Kevin Rowland rips off Kevin Archer. And Kevin Rowland was like, "That's not what I meant," you know. And then he sent this like, and I advised him not to. He sent this really aggressive fax to Piers Morgan, who, to his credit, and he's a vile man, Piers Morgan, nobody likes him, right? He just sent the fax back, and all it said on it was, "Come off it, Eileen." I was just like, respect. And I had to give this to Kevin. He's like, "What does this mean?" And I'm like, oh, Kev, mate, just, you know, don't die on these hills.
Oh
Don't die on these
dear.
hills. There's no need to.
And how were you coping? I mean, you know, I don't know if you've seen it kind of in the last couple of years. Woodstock 99. Obviously, there was the scene in the UK, but in America, you know, rock was very different, wasn't it? You had Soundgarden, Soul Asylum, Marilyn Manson, that kind of heavy rock rap, kind of Red Hot Chili Peppers. Were you still feeling excited about music at this stage as you got into the late 90s?
Well, yeah, I'd kind of lost a little. I mean, I love the bands that I was working with, because by then I was working with like Super Furry Animals and, you know, like amazing bands like that. You know, Teenage Fan Club was still going strong, but Radley's was still going strong. I mean, I was loving the bands that I worked with. You know, I think when you work for a record company, and when you work in a fairly intense environment like Creation Records, it's kind of difficult to go outside of the bubble sometimes of what you're working on and kind of investigate. You're surrounded by music, and you're surrounded by people that are, you know, that are playing you things and curating things for you. And of course, we had a really thriving music press then. You know, three, you know, what at that point, two weekly music
A
magazines.
lot of monthlies appeared, weren't
A lot of
there?
monthlies, a lot of Selects and Qs and Mojos and all those
And Loaded.
monthlies. And who, sorry?
Loaded came.
And well, Loaded, that's a whole other story. But yeah, I mean, you know, there was a lot of curation going on, wasn't there? And, you know, you could go and people telling you what you should listen to and advising you to listen to things. So yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I mean, I always had a little bit of a soft spot for American rock music anyway. So I was never really anti it. I never felt it was us and them, or, you know, either or. You know, I was quite happy with my, you know, fairly prosaic English indie,
Yes.
but not adverse to sticking on a bit of Soundgarden either. So, you know, I was always very eclectic in my music.
Did you, because I remember one band that I loved during, because I'd seen My Bloody Valentine at the Norwich Arts Centre, and Silverfish were supporting them at the time. And
I
I
saw them
thought,
at
wow.
UEA. I didn't see them at Norwich Arts Centre, but I did see them at University of East Anglia.
Oh, fantastic. Did they have EMF supporting them that night?
Oh, I don't think so. EMF.
Or some band who wanted a bit of street cred got, you know, wanted to support.
I
I
think they
don't.
were supported that night. I've got a very bad memory, but I think. Do you remember Deli for Deli? He used to
Yes.
Delhi for Delhi had a band called Welfare Heroin, I think. And I think that they were supporting My Bloody Valentine that night. That's really dredging it up from my memory.
I know.
Well, obviously, I worked with Silverfish as well. I worked with Leslie.
Yes.
For years.
And that because they were on Ouija Records, and then Creation did their kind of number. So yes, and they were just brilliant. There was Chris, Stewart, Leslie, and the other one, the guitarist. Yes. Yes, but then again,
Chelsea fan, who I still see at Chelsea matches. So
yes, I think I always see his posts on Facebook, and he sounded like his chest is not, his lungs aren't doing well, are they?
Oh really? He was a bit sickly, to be honest.
Yeah. So what was it like working with Silverfish at that stage? So, I mean, this is the early-ish 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, she was an absolute queen. I mean, I just thought she was amazing. This kind of tough Scottish, sort of fierce woman who just wasn't going to take any nonsense, and was a brilliant performer. And she moved to America. She ended up moving to Seattle.
That's right, and did that project called Ruby.
Ruby, yeah, which I really liked. Didn't really touch the ground really, or get any traction, but I really liked it. I thought it was a really good body of work. We did a tour. Again, one of my brilliant marketing plans with Therapy and Gallon Drunk, and it was like a three-handed tour, and Lollapalooza was like the big kind of rolling touring festival at the time, and I had a brilliant idea, and I was going to call it Big Money Loser, and so so we did that tour, but it was quite successful. The Gallon Drunk, Therapy, and Silverfish.
Yes, I could imagine. Yeah, I guess they had a sort of certain limitation on their sound, really. But I did love them. I thought they were just stunning. And Leslie was just brilliant. And yes. So then when Creation finishes, what's it like? Because you've been doing music now for nearly 11 years, and then that chapter's finished. How did you cope with that?
Didn't really. I mean, I got told by Alan that he was going to sell the company, and that was really scary and really worrying, because I'd spent my entire career, if you can call it that, to that point in record companies. And then he was like, go and start your own company, go and start your own PR company. And I'm like, but I haven't got any clients. He goes, well, I'll be a client. I'll be your first client. And I'll give you a room in my building that he bought, a cupboard, and you can start your own company. And I didn't know what I was doing. I had no idea. I was a little bit worried. I had a, family by then, and I was, how am I going to pay the mortgage? All these things were going through my head. I'd quite enjoyed the kind of salary and the kudos of being director of communications at a famous record company. And I sent out a bunch of letters as email was in 2000 wasn't as widespread as it is now. And the first person that replied to the letter, I just went through the Music Week directory and just wrote to all of these record companies. The first person that responded was a guy called Jeremy Marsh, who was like a major label, big dog, who'd gone and taken over Telstar Records, who was and Deck and Terrible Compilation Records. And he's like, I got your letter, and he said, I know who you are. I really like what you've done with, Oasis and Primal Scream and all these bands. You're obviously very good at your job. He said, I've just taken over as managing director at Telstar Records. We've got this kid who we think is going to be quite big, and his name's Craig David. And I was like, oh, okay. And
yes,
10 million albums later, you know what I mean? So I suddenly found myself in the middle of, of that world, doing Mystique and Craig David and all that stuff, pivoting into British urban music.
Blimey, it's quite bizarre, isn't it? Because there's a guy called Julian Henry. I'd love to remember but he was in a band called the Hit Parade, and very sensitive singer-songwriter. Then realised that
he became a PR guy, didn't
he? He became, and then I think worked with people like the Spice Girls and major.
Yeah, he was not Simon Cowell, the other guy that manages the Spice Girls.
Yes. And then he sort of moved into that world, but occasionally makes these rather delicate and beautiful kind of acoustic records with the Hit Parade, who I just, John Peel played a couple of their singles. I thought, God, this is the band for me in 1985. And then it's like, God, Julian, you've done it. But a beautiful, just a great career. So then you're obviously a very different sort of the O
Yeah, I was
years,
working with
really.
like So Solid Crew, all these mad bands, Cheeky Girls. I mean, so far removed from the kind of enemy cool that I'd spent the previous 10 years doing. And then I think it was around the time of the dot-com boom, and I got very interested in the potential for what that was going to do for the music industry, and I picked up a couple of clients that were venture capital funded, MP3.com and Vitaminic and People Sound. And these were companies that were in the very, very early download companies, but they had loads of money and they threw loads of money at me, like 10 grand a month retainer, like big money. And I was able to build a company off the back of that, still doing kind of bands, and some of the creation bands that Sony had taken on were coming back, and I was doing records with them and various other things. I had a staff, but I was getting more and more interested in what was happening with the music industry. I pivoted into this kind of corporate PR world of working with record companies and publishers and streaming companies, and then, as I always say, 9/11 happened and the dot-com bubble burst, and all that business went away, and I had to really think about what I was going to do. And eventually I sort of pivoted out of bands completely and just focused my energies on the industry and started working on the trade. And so where I've made my name over the last 15, 20 years is in corporate PR, is basically being the guy you go to if you want to talk to the music industry. So
Right. Blimey. God, you've done it all, haven't you?
I've got all these discs behind me, which are all the bands I've worked for. But I mean, and they range from like the Hives to the Plain White Tees to Craig and Mystique, and I mean, there's a whole range of things, and they're not even all up on the wall. But I haven't really done a band for years. Not
No.
really.
So what? So just run by me what it is now that what you've been doing in the last 10 years, which is quite different.
Well, longer than 10 years, really. I mean, it's essentially I get hired by music industry people, so labels, publishers, lawyers, live event companies. I do lots of crisis management. I do trade associations. So I do Music Venue Trust, and I do Live, which is the umbrella company for the live music world. They look after 15 trade associations in the live music space. So I'm very involved in kind of campaigning and advocacy for grassroots music venues, for example. But I also work for big venal catalog acquisition companies and AI development companies and startups and all sorts of things. But it's talking to the industry. So I talk to Music Week and Music Business Worldwide and Billboard rather than Mojo, Q, and Kerrang.
Yes.
That makes sense. So it can be quite complex and a bit crunchy and a bit granular sometimes, but as you say, I'm almost 60 now. It's just not dignified to be sitting in the back of a tour bus with a bunch of 25-year-olds who want to get off their heads. One of the kind of legacy things of working at Creation Records is I've been sober for 28 years. So it's like I just don't live a rock and roll lifestyle anymore.
But it was quite interesting. I remember John Walters, the producer of John Peel, once said, and I guess it's what made John Peel so good in many respects was that, I mean, John Walters said, if John Peel ever hits puberty, we'll be in trouble. It's that kind of having that youthful, I still want to hear some 16-year-olds play and sing about what they're into, which is very difficult when you're 60, thinking, I can't quite.
I'm really good mates with Steve Lemacq. Steve Lemacq's like a really good friend of mine. And we work together for Live, and he's a patron of Music Venue Trust, and we've sort of grown up together really. I knew him when he was like a news editor on the NME, and he'll still say, have you heard the new Idols record? Have you heard the new Fontaines DC record? Back I mean, I'm giving two examples that are a few years old now, but
yes,
thing he'd be but we'll still go and see like Boys Wonder together, who've recently reformed for a one-off gig. What I mean? It's like, wow, they're all 60 now, but this is brilliant. So I mean, and again, when you've got kids, I've got 30-year-old sons, who love, Kendrick Lamar and Drake and all that stuff, and they'll keep me abreast of what's going on with that. And my daughter's a huge pop fan, so I get all of the Chapel Roan and Sabrina Carpenter stuff as well. But and I listen to Six Music, and I try and keep an interest. And I've got the vinyl collection. I've got I've got a Sonos thing that I play Spotify through. I'm trying not to to be a silly old sod who just listens to records from 1995.
No, absolutely no. It's good. I just have a problem now with without John Peel, knowing where to go to find that. Wow, have you?
Curators, yeah, I think lack of gatekeepers, lack of curators. I agree with you. I totally agree with you. Sometimes I don't want to. I don't want a Spotify algorithm. I want someone to turn around and go excitedly, "Have you heard?"
Yes, I know.
That's what I like. I've still
It
got
is.
friends who do that.
And yeah, that is because I mean, I know it's a bit of a thing. Listen to music from sort of 30 or 40 years ago, and I don't listen to stuff that used to listen to then, but I do still go back to that period, listening to all the bands I missed and all the sort of little
Mm.
singles, or a lot of bands from that period never actually did an album. They did a lot of, EPs, singles, flexi discs, then they broke up. Then someone's come along and put a compilation together. And I find that fascinating. And John Peel might have, played a few of the songs, or they had a Peel session or an Andy Kershaw session. So it's quite nice. But I do realise I'm still listening to music made back then rather than now. But it's just knowing who to trust and who hasn't just been given the playlist to go play
Nothing
this.
wrong. There's nothing wrong with sticking on a Verve album, or there's nothing wrong with that. For getting a nostalgia rush. And listen, I've got a whole room full of records from that period that I'll happily put on and wallow in. I think it's just sometimes you can't just have your head down all the time. You got to, because you don't know what's out there. Some things just blow your mind. I mean, I think there's some of the music that comes out of out of America at the moment is amazing, and I think that I would never get any access to it if I didn't have kids who kind of pointed me at it, or or had a shared family Spotify account, which I could see it on. But and I'll read a book, and somebody will talk about a particular artist in a book, and I'll go and follow up that. But it's very difficult when you haven't got the Enemy and Melody Maker, which you used to get on a Thursday morning, and just flick through to this singles page, and go and listen to them, or the albums page, and see an amazing review of an album. This doesn't really exist anymore, does it? And we've got Later, and that's about it, isn't it? Really, Later
No.
is music.
I have Readly, and I sort of look at Billboard, and I sort of go, gosh, this is a lot of adverts. And so
It's impenetrable, absolutely impenetrable.
they've always got some award.
Huge amounts of awards, huge amounts of power player lists, and and several features about Bad Bunny in every issue, or these days mostly about sort of Teddy Swims and all these kind of all these new country artists that seem to be selling bazillions of streams, that I've never heard of.
Yes.
We're suddenly headlining Hyde Park in the summer, and it's like, who are you? I've never heard of you. It's like.
I did an interview with somebody who was kind of probably in one of those obscure bands, but then he said, "Oh yeah, my wife manages Bad Bunny," and I looked up and went, "Oh, no wonder you don't have to work then."
Yeah, Bad Bunny, man. I mean, it's like, but but the thing is, this is a great example of kind of English British exceptionalism, where we go, oh yeah, it's Ed Sheeran and Adele, and they don't even touch the size of what Bad Bunny does. I mean, Bad Bunny does so many millions of streams and
Billions.
plays so many stadiums. I mean, that's without even looking at South Korea. It's like we're sitting there going, "Oh, Adele, she's massive." She's not even anywhere near the numbers that some of those Latin artists are doing.
I know, it's good. So I went through a Bad Bunny phase because I was thinking, I was just curious. I thought that was amazing. So, as we touched on that world of the gatekeepers with the weekly music papers, and then what I realized when bands were getting together during that period, they had that circuit around the UK and their trusty transit, all the Norwich Arts Centre, Leeds, the Duchess and the Square in Harlow, and et cetera, et cetera. They all
Most of
had
which
those venues.
I wouldn't be doing my job without saying most of those have now gone.
Most of those have gone.
And we are now currently losing 2 grassroots music venues a week, and it's like, it's collapsing all around us. So sorry to interrupt you, but it's important to kind of say to those people listening, if they're not of our age, a lot of those venues are gone. So
Yes.
it's a real shame. All the ones you mentioned, they're not there anymore, I don't think.
No,
Harlem Park,
the Princess Charlotte in Leicester.
Charlotte, the Hull of Delphi, all of these places, they don't exist anymore.
So what do as you in your position then, how are you trying or addressing those kind of problems? And then we have Brexit and touring Europe's become difficult.
Very difficult. I mean, that's an issue of itself that's hopefully being addressed by this new government. To create create fast lanes for for visas and opportunities for bands, not only to go out but to come here as well. But on the venue side of things, we recently launched what's called the Live Trust,
Hmm.
where we lobbied very heavily for every show that happens at an arena or a stadium over 5,000 capacity should put £1 on every ticket, which would then go back into the Live Trust, which would then go to support the grassroots community, whether that's artists or promoters or music venues, with the primary aim of keeping music venues alive. Because at the moment there's about 800, but I say we're losing them so fast.
Mm.
And if we're not careful, we just will not have that infrastructure. And there was a piece of data that came out recently that talked about how the touring circuit itself has shrunk enormously. It used to be 30, 40 dates, and now it's like 12. And there are lots of towns and lots of cities that don't have any access to live music anymore. They just don't have it. I think Norwich, you still got a couple,
So
but
we've got the UEA, then there's the Waterfront and the Norwich Arts Centre, but
yeah,
yeah,
but
and then
there's
but
nothing
the,
in Derby. There's nothing in some of these towns that you would think, well, why not? They just don't exist. So if you're a young person growing up in one of these towns without a grassroots music venue, where are you going to discover music? TikTok?
yeah, and also for a band, it's like playing live is where you start to develop your craft, your apprenticeship,
100%.
and
100%.
knowing, are you going to be able to still do it at 4 o'clock when you have to unload your stuff back in your place in
And they keep
November?
building these megadomes. They keep building these arenas. They keep building the Co-op Live in Manchester. Who do they think are going to play them in 15 years' time?
The Eagles.
I mean, they're going to be dead, David.
I know, I'm
Why?
joking.
They did a survey of the first 40 bands to play at the Co-op Live. Something like 45% were over the age of 50.
I know.
That's that. Your festival headliners, your arena headliners, certainly your stadium headliners, they're not going to be around in 15, 25 years.
I know.
They're going to
Black
come from
Sabbath are
young
not going to do
grassroots
many
communities.
more gigs, are they?
No, exactly.
So, but then, you've got and then Europe, because again, talking to various people, you used to, I guess these are bands like, I don't know, there was a guy, Fish, and then there was the Godfathers, that band, and they used to say, look, we can just about keep the band going if we can do Europe. We'll do 30 dates, 30 days, just hammer it. And then it's like Brexit comes along and it's like the end of that. This pays for the band and our life for the rest of the year, especially the merch store in Germany. How do bands now deal with that without having that, access to
Well, I
life?
mean, I think you've still got festivals. Festivals have expanded over the years. So you'll find most bands will still go out and do the festival circuit throughout Europe, and that will do it. Well, recently did a show with Kate Nash, and Kate Nash came along to the launch of the annual report that was issued by the Music Venue Trust, which we did in the House of Commons. And she came along and played a few songs and gave a brilliant speech about how difficult it is, even for an artist of her stature that can sell out rooms, can sell out decent sized rooms, how difficult it is, even with touring opportunities in Europe, to pay her crew properly, to pay her band properly.
Mm.
That everybody thinks that everybody's making loads of money on the road. And whilst there is more money in tickets than there's ever been, it's still difficult. It's still really hard because of the lack of opportunities out there, and the problems and the self-inflicted wounds that we've put in place over Brexit, as you say. But hopefully there are conversations going on above my pay grade to get that sorted out.
And is this kind of new government, are they a bit more sympathetic or
Very
understand?
engaged. They're very engaged. I think they understand the economic benefit of music. They understand that, and they understand the soft power that music brings to this country. It's not just about pounds and pennies. It's about soft power. It's about being able to turn around and say the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Clash and Oasis, and Stormzy. It's about being able to say that and being at the center of the musical universe. I mean, but also it also generates huge amounts of money. And so
Yes.
any government in their right mind is going to want to protect that.
And sort of the pricing system. I sort of listened to Robert Smith recently talking about, like artists pretending they didn't understand that, ticket prices go shooting up. And he said, no, I wanted it to be at this amount. Have you kind of started to address those things that kind of make fans quite disillusioned when you go, my God, I got to this?
There's a lot of conversations going on about dynamic pricing. And I think that's not going away. I think unfortunately, you're going to pay for your tickets like you pay for your airline flight and your hotel, and it will be based on supply and demand. However, I think the argument is around transparency. And Oasis threw that into sharp relief, didn't they, when they put their tour on sale, and people thought they were buying a £60 ticket, and they got to the checkout and it was suddenly £300, and they're like, "Well, how did that happen?" And that's dynamic pricing apparently. And it's like, well, if you tell people that 75% of the tickets are going to be £60 to £90, but after that the prices are going to be dynamically priced according to demand, then I think people might accept that, because they accept that with hotels and they accept it with flights and they accept it with other things that we live with. But it's this kind of slightly FOMO aspect that that particularly in our industry we prey on, that has not gone down well. And in fact, Ticketmaster have been appearing before the Common Select Committee this week going, there is no algorithm, it doesn't exist, it's about dynamic pricing. So I think we've got to stop touting, we've got to stop secondary ticketing, because that's a blight, and we've got to make dynamic pricing more transparent. And I think there will always be supply and demand. There's only so many tickets you can sell for any particular place. And unfortunately, we live in a society that that creates demand. So capitalist society. So there are people involved that want to make money.
Yes.
And so how to do it. I think you don't have to be unkind, and you don't have to be venal, and you certainly don't have to be criminal about it. Let's put in place a system that says, okay, this is how it is. Sorry if you can't get a ticket, and I'm sorry if it's expensive, but this is it. You make your choice based on that, and then it's up to the band, like Cure, to turn around and go, we're not going to do that. But unfortunately, a lot of bands just go, oh, my manager deals with that, my lawyer deals with that, I'm not getting involved. I don't want to get into that grown-up stuff. More bands need to get involved and have a think about how it impacts their fans.
Yes. And then sort of AI, I mean, another new one on your agenda, things to do. How are you tackling that aspect of the creative industries?
I don't really understand it, David, if I'm honest. I mean, I'm working with a few companies. It's coming. It's not going away. It's a little bit like streaming and downloads. It's not going away. We have to deal with it. The big issue at the moment is training music on existing catalogue, and basically saying, I'll just train it on Oasis and create the new Oasis, or create versions of Oasis, or versions of whoever your favorite band are, and and create beats and loops trained on other copyrighted material for which no payment is given. That's the big issue. And that's not just in music. I think that's in all the creative arts, whether it's photography or theatre or film or whatever.
Yes.
So we have to think very, very closely about AI image rights and what copyright means in the AI age. But there are also lots of platforms that are allowing musicians to keep copyright, to basically create AI remixes or AI versions that are controlled by the artist or controlled by the content owner. And so it's not all bad. It's just, unfortunately, the kind of the scary bad stuff is getting all the press at the moment. There's quite a lot of companies that are basically saying, look, we can amplify your existing music, we can amplify your work, we can make it quicker, more efficient, we can make it better, and you control it. We're not training it, we're giving it to you, or you're paying us to use our platform to create it. So I think it's going to be like any tool. I think it's going to take a while for people to understand how to use it, much like the synthesizer or or other kind of production tools. But once they do, I think it will just be part of what we do.
Yes.
There's things around image rights for sure, and they are being addressed, hopefully.
And that, dear listener, is generally the end of the interview. A massive thank you to Andy Saunders for giving me the time for that. This has been the C86 Show. If you want to contact me, you can on all the usual social media platform sites. Just do C86 Show. David Eastaugh. All these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. Do check them out. They're fascinating, especially anything to do with the 80s indie world. Anyway, in the meantime, have a great week. Stay safe.